now with the numbers, so I think we'll crack on, and I know some people will join a little bit later anyway. So thanks everyone for joining us today in this webinar. We're going to be talking about SDGs in the workflow. The webinar is recorded, so and this will make the slides available afterwards, so don't feel like you have to take a ton of notes. There's a Q&A and a chat, so if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll either answer as we go along if it fits in, or we've got time for question and a bit of a discussion at the end as well, so please feel free to put in your questions. So my name is Romy Beard. I'm the head of publisher relations at Chronosub, and I'll be moderating the webinar today, and I've got my three lovely speakers here today: Dana Compton from the American Society of Civil Engineers, then we've got Sarah Yeo from Cell Press, and Tyler Roos from Digital Science. So the format of the webinar, if you've not been to any of my webinars before, we'll have short presentations from each of the speakers. And then after that, we'll have a bit of discussion about the topic, and each of them will dive into different aspects of what we'll talk about today. But the focus is really sustainable development goals and how we can capture information of those in the article publishing workflow earlier on, and we'll talk about what potential there is maybe that isn't being done yet in terms of, you know, where we could go next. So I'll hand over to Dana, who will be talking about the SDG Publishers Compacts, and give us a little bit of an overview of what the SDGs are and what publishers can do about it. All yours, Dana.
Great. Thank you so much, Romy, and thank you everybody for joining today and taking some time. So as Romy mentioned, I'm Dana Compton. I'm the MD and publisher at American Society of Civil Engineers. And although we've done a ton of work around the SDGs at ASCE that I'm really quite proud of, as the publisher, I'm not here as the publisher of ASCE today. So two of my other roles, aside from my real job, are as an SDG Publishers Compact Fellow that I'll speak a little bit about, as well as a member of the STM Social Responsibility Committee, which takes responsibility for STM's strategy around SDGs and research. So I'm going to speak a little bit about initiatives from those two groups today. So make sure my slide advances here. Okay, so I do want to start with a little bit of an overview of what the SDGs are. And I think the key point here is that the SDGs are not just about climate. I think that's a misconception that I've heard a lot as I've learned more and more about the SDGs. So the SDGs are quite broad, including SDGs around inclusion and diversity and education and health. So when we think about the research landscape, the SDGs are relevant almost everywhere. In April of this year, I had the pleasure of speaking at the STM annual conference, and I was on a panel about the SDGs and research. And one of my co-panelists was Anne Bainan from Clarivet, and she's done some data analysis work around SDG alignment in the published research literature. So using Web of Science data from 2017 through 2022, she shared with our group at STM that SDG research actually already accounts for almost half of all indexed research, and has over 7.4 million citations. What's interesting about that is that she found that although that's already accounting for so much of the research literature that's indexed, there is much more that isn't being appropriately tagged so that it can be discovered and identified as SDG aligned. So there is a limitation in accurately assessing how much research literature aligns to the SDGs. The other interesting point that she made at STM was that every single classification in Web of Science does have a significant proportion of identified SDG aligned research, which just further drives home the point that the SDGs are relevant everywhere. So what is the Publishers Compact? So this is essentially a set of commitments that publishers, whether society or commercial or any field, can sign on to state their commitment to accelerating process towards the SDGs. This was launched by IPA and the UN Publications team jointly. And it was announced at the Frankfurt Book Fair in October of 2020. So to date, over the past 3 years, the compact has garnered over 300 signatories. So to talk a little bit about what the commitments themselves actually cover, they're essentially grouped into three main areas. The first being prioritizing sustainability. So these are things like making a commitment to advancing the SDGs in itself, annually reporting on progress, and nominating a person who is essentially responsible for ensuring progress. Raising awareness is another category. This is in terms of, on the content side, acquiring and promoting related content, raising awareness among your staff, among your suppliers, and essentially being an advocate to all your stakeholders that the SDGs are important and that you are committed. And then really taking action across geographic locations, putting budget towards your activities and taking firm action. So identifying at least one goal where you will take firm action. Becoming a signatory, I'm not going to go into all the details, but the key point here is you select up to 3 SDGs in which you will focus. That doesn't mean that those are the only ones you can act on, but they do require you to select something relevant. But the key thing here is there isn't a bar to commitment. You don't need to have an established sustainability plan to be a signatory. You don't need to already have a strategy, already have the budget. All you need is a willingness to get there. So the key point is don't let perfect be the enemy of good. So with that said, the 2 groups that I mentioned earlier, the Compact Fellows and the STM Social Responsibility Committee, certainly don't want commitment to end up being an empty promise. And so both of the groups are working towards resources that allow publishers to figure out what to do and how to do it to make progress. So the Compact Fellows, this is an outdated photo. There are actually more of us now than there were at the time when we created this, but we're essentially a cross-industry group that are committed to creating resources to allow publishers to progress in their goal of accelerating the SDGs, not just publishers. One of the key resources that we work on are action tips. So these are a selection of the action tips that we've created. We aim to create action tips that give concrete steps that different constituencies can take, whether whether an academic publisher or an editor, a researcher, a student, a practitioner. We've also recently released, which is not on this slide, an action tip towards advancing equity in research publishing. Along with action tips, we do occasionally hold educational events where we try to get out there as much as possible and talk about our work through forums like these and meetings, publishing meetings around the world. So to move, there we go. I think that's going to now go twice. Yeah. There we go. So on the STM side, a key thing that the Social Responsibility Group has released is actually a roadmap that breaks down actions publishers can take into 5 phase steps. So we're trying to show that the bar here is very, very low. So you can begin in year 1 with simply engaging with the SDGs. educating your leadership about where the SDGs align to your missions, your organization's mission, raising awareness. And then there are steps that you can take moving forward from there. So the point is to suggest concrete steps to live up to the Publishers Compact commitments, whether your organization is big or small, regardless of how many resources you have, and really just to open up the thinking around what you might do rather than being prescriptive. So level 1 has already been released, and then we'll have a level 2 and a 3 coming soon. This is just a little sneak peek of level 1, so you can get a sense for the types of things that are covered in the roadmap. So this is really talking about, really the very first steps, what you might do in the first 6 months after becoming a signatory. And with that, I did want to mention one other thing, another item that social responsibility is working on, kind of hearkening back to Ann Banon's data about research actually being identified as SDG aligned as a taxonomy picker, which I think will really help with consistency and give a practical tool for publishers to be able to identify content. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah, and thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dana. So my name's Sarah Yao, and I'm a senior editorial operations supervisor at Cell Press. Basically, the main kind of core part of my role is working with our journals to kind of continue to innovate and create effective workflows for editors, our authors, and our reviewers. Today, I'm talking about 2 of our journals in particular and how they utilize UN SDGs as part of their workflow. Chem and Chem Catalysis. Chem launched back in 2016 and is a sister journal to Cell. Chem provides a home for seminal and insightful research and showcases how fundamental studies in chemistry and its subdisciplines may help in finding potential solutions to the global challenges of tomorrow. Chem Catalysis launched 2 years ago in 2021, and they focus on publishing innovative and insightful research on fundamental and applied catalysis, providing a platform for researchers across chemistry, chemical engineering, and related fields to disseminate and promote their work. So to kind of get started on why do we link our articles to UN Sustainable Development Goals, essentially we started asking authors to provide us with this information and back when Chem first launched and Chem Catalysis since launched. And we are continuing to make sure that all of our articles are linked to these goals. The main reasons why are pretty straightforward. One of the main aims of both Chem and Chem Catalysis is that we are trying to showcase advances in chemistry, which can help tackle the big challenges of the 21st century. For Chem Catalysis in particular, catalysis is a key technology for improving the efficiency and sustainability of the production of chemicals and is central to advancing research in renewable energy, healthcare, and environmental science. And this particularly links this research to UN SDGs. Overall, we encourage authors to give broader context for the importance of their research. This helps bridge gaps between the researcher and people who may be less familiar with their area of study. One way that we do this is by asking authors to include a bigger picture statement, which is 1 to 2 paragraphs that summarizes and contextualizes the results for non-experts that might not have full understanding of that field in particular. And linking the paper directly to a UN SDG takes this goal of giving the research a broader context a step further, as it links the research directly to global issues that the UN has identified. So to kind of get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty, to ease this process for our authors, we select a subset of the SDGs for authors to select from that are most relevant to our journals' scopes. The main reasons why is because we found that typically they want to select them in these areas anyway, and having all the options there can be a little bit overwhelming. So for Chem, we've selected 10, and that's zero hunger, good health and well-being, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, industry, innovation, infrastructure, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, and life on land. And we've done something very similar at chemcatalysis because the initiative was successful at chem. We've limited it to 5 though instead, just good health and well-being, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, industry innovation, infrastructure, and climate action. If an author came to us and said that they wanted to publish under one of the other SDGs instead, I'm fairly confident that we would allow them to, or in addition to these. But this kind of makes it so that's a little bit more targeted for them while they're looking at these and trying to kind of identify which SDGs might be the best fit for their articles. On to the next one. So to ensure that authors are aware of this request, we ensure that it's featured really predominantly within our instructions for authors, our journals, its aims and scopes, as well as the EM homepages that you see displayed here. One of the things that you'll see is that it kind of gives a brief blurb about what the general scope is of these journals here, but then it also also talks about how we do link all of our research to the SDGs, just to make sure that authors are as aware of this request as possible before they go ahead and try to submit their paper. And so they have time to kind of think about it and prepare. While they're submitting their paper, they will be asked on this page during the submissions process for that information. As we require that at least one is selected for submission, we do give them one that give them an option, and if they're really not sure which one might be the best fit, by asking them to select industry, innovation, and infrastructure, just because, quite frankly, it's very broad, but also because it's something that likely a good number of our papers will fit into. Our editorial team does review their selection while they consider the article and will help the author adjust their selection if needed. Once the author clicks Add Classifications here, a pop-up will appear and they can select as many or as few as they'd like. So here you can see I've basically gone ahead, checked one off, clicked Add, and then moved it over into the ones that are selected. From there, the author would click Submit, and then they can go on their merry way completing the submission of their article. Once the if the article is accepted for publication, the SDGs are passed along to our production team and then are published with the article. As you can see here in the sidebar, there's a link to where they can navigate where they are within the article. And then down here, you'll be able to see that they're listed underneath here. And then if you kind of zoom in, you can see that they've selected a few different SDGs to publish with their articles. So it's not just limited to the one they've selected. This person selected 5, which is great. Some people might only have 1 selected though, and that would be completely fine as well. And then if you click on them, it will automatically pull a search on our website so that you can see what other ones are also published under that SDG. So here, for example, I clicked on SDG 7 for that article, and I was able to see all the other articles at Cell Press that reference that article. So I would be able to view it both between chem and chemcatalysis. This also allows readers to see what else might have been published in that area, which is helpful to them as well. And then finally, chem and chemcatalysis, the authors also write an In This Issue every issue where they summarize the content of the most interesting articles according to the editorial team. And the articles that they feature are grouped based on their SDGs, further highlighting their connections to these individual articles. So as you can see, this article up here by Dr. Fan, I believe is what it says. It's a little small for me too. Is basically under UN SDG 7 under affordable and clean energy. And this further highlights, of course, their connection to the SDGs. And that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening, and let me know if you have any questions. And over to Tyler.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Appreciate that. Okay, so I'm Tyler Roos. I'm the Director of Publisher Solutions at Digital Science, and we're going to talk a little bit today about the UN Sustainable Development Goals and how we've deployed them in our Dimensions product. So to start with, there we go. Because the UN SDGs are such a compelling lens to look at research through, we decided back in 2020 that we wanted to be able to deploy SDGs across all of the publications data we have in Dimensions and really make that part of the analytical tool set that's available. And because that was 2020, there was no, because that was 2020, there was no source of data either from publishers or authors really to sort of drive the application of those SDGs to previously published publications and currently published publications. So what we decided to do is leverage some of the other classification tools we'd already built within Dimensions. Those typically were applied to more classical subject area definitions and the application of those to publications. So things like subject areas like chemistry or physics, et cetera. But what we were able to do then was to build a training set and create a new model around specifically automatically tagging and classifying documents to the SDGs. So that was a combination of developing that training set and then manual curation and correction to develop the sort of machine learning model around how to automatically apply those classifications to documents. So our focus was really trying to stay true to the stricter version of the definitions of the categories themselves. And we wanted to really err on the side of fewer false positives and really sort of be conservative in our approach and make sure that we were really taking a clean way of developing the classification tool sets themselves. We leveraged some interesting techniques there, such as adjusting nuances for American English versus British English. We wanted to build in safeguards against buzzword interference because that's always something that we found can definitely impact the automation around classification of documents. And then we really wanted to leverage proximity parameters. So really looking at where words appeared and what words appeared in between those words, because we're really looking for exact phrasing and things that we knew were really sort of key to defining the UN SDGs in those publications themselves. So really we built this system, again, leveraging some of the other techniques we'd already developed so that uncategorized documents could come into Dimensions, run through this process, and we could automatically then tag where possible any UN SDGs that might be applicable to those particular publications. Okay, so at the end of that process, we were able to run all of the publication documents, so 138 million documents essentially, through the tool set themselves to try and identify those UN SDGs and how they apply to publications. We wanted to support a host of use cases with this that we found really interesting, including some that were really focused on publishers using this particular data. So one of the more obvious ones, as I think Dana mentioned in her slides, is the ability to report on publication output and look at a particular publisher or a particular journal or even just a set of publications and really be able to report on how those mapped to SDGs, how that changes over time, how that improves over time, et cetera. So we really wanted to be able to provide that sort of analytical view within Dimensions. We also wanted to support sort of KPI or goal development. So as you thought about where you wanted to go as a publisher, where you wanted to be as it relates to publication output mapping to SDGs, we wanted to give you a good sense of cross-publisher, cross-subject area, cross-geography, sort of what the state was of that particular current SDG and be able to sort of rationalize some of the decisions you were making around sort of where you wanted to get to as it relates to, again, the sort of SDG application to your publications, to your research output. So the charts here just illustrate one of the differences there, one of the nuances. The chart on the left is really the top 5 UN SDG applications by percentage of publications to books and monographs. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at the application by percentage to journal articles. So again, it can vary quite differently by publication type, in addition to things like subject area and the geography of researchers, et cetera. So we wanted to bring all of those tools to bear if we could, so that those could be leveraged in a variety of ways. And we also saw value in the application of the SDGs at the publication level here, and sort of broadly speaking, how we do things in Dimensions, so that you can use it for other things like building special collections, right? So if you wanted to launch a micro platform or a microsite that were focused on all of the publications you had around quality education, you could easily sort of develop a collection list using the data that we've got across all of the different publications to build that collection. And you can also obviously use that for marketing purposes to really highlight to authors submitting to particular journals what the sort of track record or history is of the publications in that journal mapping to UN Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, so one of the other things we really did want to do is take the technology that we built and not just use it sort of retrospectively. While that's got its own merit and its own value, obviously, we also wanted to make sure that we developed a real-time technology around that so that publishers that had access to the Dimensions API could really use that tool set anywhere in workflow. So we developed a real-time response API that, feeding in a title and abstract into our tools, could give you back an SDG or more than one SDG, depending on our technology, mapping to that specific document. So it could be all the way up at submission, it could be in review, it could be anywhere in the editorial process. You could actually acquire that information and include it in your own systems based on our automated technologies. And so we really wanted to be able to, again, sort of build that capability set within the tool that we've built, so that it's not just looking at data that's already been published, publications that have already happened. We wanted to be able to get in front of that. So in this example, I'm using our API to submit a title and abstract of a document that is not in Dimension, so it hasn't gone through that traditional ingestion workflow into the database itself. And you can see that I've gotten a response back at the bottom that this particular document has been classified as Life Below Water, or UN SDG 14. So really, again, we wanted to be able to create flexibility around using the tool set and not just using it for analytical purposes, but use it for real-time assessment purposes as well. Okay, so the next sort of vision we had was looking outside of publications themselves. So knowing that there are other document types and dimensions, we wanted to then expand the tool set that we developed to look at categorizing other document types. So the first one we took a look at was sort of classifying all of the grants data in Dimensions. So looking at funding projects themselves, those abstracts themselves, and see if we can apply those SDGs to the grants data themselves. So we could look a little bit around landscape sort of analysis to sort of see how funding maps to what might be SDG related grants, but then also identify geographical hotspots, understand sort of what's been happening in funding across the board as it applies to SDGs. Are those changing over time? Are we seeing an increase in funding over time as it relates to different SDGs? And specifically, do those change by SDG and do those change by geography? So this particular chart is showing the top 5 SDGs by total funding year over year. So instead of looking through the lens of just publication output, we're looking at how much research funding is being applied to grants that have mapped to sustainable development goals. And from here, we started to think about how do we then do a full 360-degree sort of view of research as it relates to SDGs. And one of our goals was to be able to look at a particular publication, identify that it was mapped to an SDG, let's say climate action, for example, but then look at all of the citing publications and see what SDGs those citing publications were mapped to as well. Were they all climate action, or were they maybe adjacent SDGs like affordable and clean energy? And then take a step backwards and look and see, was the collection of different research grants that funded this research also mapped to those SDGs, or did it evolve over time from the inception of the award of that grant to the actual resulting publications? Or is there a complete spectrum and matrix of different publication research output from a series of grants that sort of spread out from a particular SDG that was in the original funding data all the way out to a variety of different research publications? So we wanted to really sort of take a broader look and see, how does the application of SDGs start with funding and go all the way to research output? And then my final slide here is that when we rolled out this technology in 2020, we had a team of data scientists and data analysts at Digital Science who put together a white paper titled Contextualizing Sustainable Development Research. And it was really using all of this data that we had in Dimensions around the application of SDGs to publications to answer a whole bunch of different very interesting questions that they had posed to themselves. One of which this chart illustrates, which is essentially looking at sort of a radar view, if you will, of research output by country and what UN SDGs do they lean into. So just thinking about sort of the local impact or the regional impact of research and where the maybe areas of emphasis might be based on geographic location. So you can sort of see some of the spikes. For example, you see some spikes in Japan that reach towards 11 and 13 and 7. You see in the United States, we lean heavily into 3 and then also into 13 as SDGs. But it's really interesting to visualize this to sort of just understand what the total percentage of research output is mapped to those SDGs, and how does that change based on the location or regionality of the researchers themselves. And so I'll close with a quote from this particular white paper that we wrote. This says basically, while the SDG themes are global in scope and scale, the issues they often address are local and immediate. So just kind of think about not only the broad implications of SDGs, but also the localized as well. And with that, I will say thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone. That was fantastic. Great overview, and we all kept to time. It was amazing. I have a bunch of questions for you individually, so I'm going to start with those. But maybe you also have some questions for each other. Sarah, like one of the things like I talk a lot about in terms of workflow is how metadata changes, like from ad submission and during the process and later on what's actually published. And I know you talked a little bit about editors helping authors to correct their SDG choice. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that and like what the difference is between what authors pick and what later ends up in the published paper.
Yeah,
and what
so
that process looks like.
Yeah, so one of the things of course, our editors, of course, read the papers and go through them, and then we'll send them out for peer review. On their side, there is a classification tool. It actually looks really similar to what it looks like for the author within their own menus. And so they have the ability to go in and add them or remove them. If they do that, they of course discuss that with the author because it would appear with the published paper. Where they might say, okay, well, have you considered XYZ one? I've added it, but, let me know if, you think it isn't appropriate for whatever reason. I would say, I don't know off the top of my head how frequently authors go, oh no, this is not something I really anticipated, but I would imagine it's probably relatively rare that they actually do end up going in and editing them, where if they're removing them, I would imagine if they're doing it, it's likely adding. And then from there, the SDGs that they would add would also appear within the proofs as well. So the authors would really have, up until the point of publication, I believe, the ability to go in and change them if they felt like they needed to.
Mm-hmm. And Tyler, maybe you can, because from what I understand, Sarah, for your process is very much the author selected, the editor selected, they look at the paper, whereas what Tyler at Dimensions developed is really kind of an AI powered version of that, where you could put in the whole paper and it would tell you what 2 or 5 SDGs are discussed in the paper. Is that correct, Tyler?
That is correct. Yes.
Like
So we built
API.
Yeah, so we build technology both on the back end of Dimensions and front end in that API that analyzes the terms in the title and abstract to derive an SDG and tag. It could be one or more SDGs to that particular document.
Mm-hmm. So a publisher could use that at any point. They could use it as submission, or they could use it to analyze post-publication information.
Exactly. Both are available in terms of using the product to look retrospectively and sort of reporting again, but also then using the API to develop sort of in workflow upfront at submission analysis of SDGs.
And one question I had, something like a bit more general now, that I was wondering if publishers are presenting information on what SDGs have been covered in a journal to provide that information to authors when they choose to publish. Is that something that anyone is doing or is looking at? And I don't know, Sarah, if you maybe are doing that already, that you're saying, if you want to submit here, this is what are, the SDGs that have been covered, and this is how much has been published. So kind of using the post-publication stuff, but at an earlier stage.
Yeah, we don't necessarily say on our website how much have been published in each area. We do list them within our aims and scope, like these are the SDGs that you'll have to choose from. And so I think that kind of points to essentially what I think our scope is essentially. But no, we don't currently publicize like exactly the number, partially because it changes over time too, as we're publishing more and more with each issue.
To your point though, Romy, I think, and we don't do that at ASCE either right now. I have thought about that a lot, that not only to Sarah's earlier point about, making SDGs more explicitly clear in aims and scope. That's one thing, but I've been involved in so many discussions about how do we quantify the impact of SDG research specifically. And I think, really highlighting not only the volume of content, but also, some of the work that Anne at Clarivet has done in terms of citations. I think there's good data available to be able to specifically look at citations for that research. That's probably something that Clarivet could provide value on. And then, you could add to the metrics that you use to appeal to authors. Not only this is the volume and turn times and impact of this journal as a whole, but, this is the volume and impact for our SDG content. And I could see taking that a step further to a publishing portfolio to really get, author loyalty and publishing with a particular publisher who is demonstrating through their compact direct impact through their research and advancing the SDGs.
I like how you bring in the author loyalty aspect, as something I've talked a lot about is author experience, and how, whatever experience you provide to them builds brands and build your brand and gets authors to come back. And certainly SDGs play that role in there if someone's really passionate about publishing in a certain area and having that shown up in the workflow.
And I would say, to open access and SDGs are not explicitly tied together. I mean, certainly there is a slew of SDG content being published that is not open access, but as OA increases and SDG alignment increases, the whole author as a customer idea becomes more and more important.
And I really like what you finished on, Tyler, how you're looking at different countries having spikes in different directions for different SDGs. What struck me on that slide was that the majority was kind of like more high developed countries. Did you look at all at kind of lower income countries and what SDGs they cover?
We did, yeah. So
more.
Definitely, yeah. So in that paper, we definitely explored the Global South, for example, and sort of looked at how that changed or differentiated from more developed countries, and sort of did a country by country and region by region analysis, because that was an important aspect of what we were looking at as well. So definitely that was one of the things we looked at. And
you still find that within that there's spikes towards one or the other. It's not like there's one area of the world where they really cover all of it.
No, absolutely. There's definitely spikes, and sometimes I think what we found is oftentimes it's actually geographically sort of related. So obviously countries that have significant amount of waterfront area, they have a different, they might have a lot more spike towards the life underwater. And so it really, it depends. And certainly areas, I think Japan was on that list too, but like really that's about sustainable cities. So it really does depend on the geography and the economic makeup of the area, but it goes all the way from, fully developed to non-developed countries as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've got some questions from the audience as well. I'm looking at the Q&A just now. We've got a question here from Derek Love. How useful is the Dimensions API at deciphering papers that don't strictly mention the SDGs but may cover overlapping topics? Can it point to reasons why it might actually be an SDG related paper?
Yeah, so the development of the tool that we've created doesn't necessarily look for very specific terms to an SDG. There's hundreds of terms and keywords and proximity that it's factoring in. So it can really sort of identify those SDGs that wouldn't be completely obvious, even to maybe to the author, but not necessarily to other folks. And so we try to anticipate that and develop that into the tool set itself so that it does create that. And again, we look at all of our tools as classification tools, not necessarily black and white, like this is this and only this. So it's one of many ways that you could, sort of use that data itself.
Thanks, Tyler. And then we have another question. Are the SDGs included in the Crossref DOI metadata? Is that possible?
I don't work for Crossref, but I've never seen
so... I don't think they are. There's not like a specific metadata field in the Crossref metadata that would be covered by that, as I think I have asked somebody that question.
Yeah,
you know, Dana?
I couldn't say with certainty, but not to my knowledge.
I think it's not a set metadata field yet. That could be like, one field for each of the SDGs. I feel like I've had a conversation with somebody about that, but I don't remember for sure. But we can look into that, so we can't be more specific. Then we have another question from Laura Bowering-Mullen. Is it possible, say with Dimensions, to get a snapshot for a university of how the institution's authors are engaging with the SDGs? And I guess that could apply to both publishing SDG-related content and citing SDG-related content.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm focused mainly on how publishers are using Dimensions for this, process, but we developed the tool set itself actually for researchers and for research institutions to look at their output, not only in the form of the grants that they were being awarded, but also the resulting publication output, and sort of do that analysis around then citation data based on future publications. So definitely that's one of the key use cases for institutions.
But the same that you would use it for a publisher. A publisher can look at what content has been published by my authors on XY SDGs. An institution could do in the same way.
Yep, exactly.
And can you remind us, Tyler, I know there's different versions of Dimensions, like, and I have seen like the SDG dropdown. That's not included in the free version, is it?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
I don't think
that's
so.
what I thought. Because I hadn't seen it. Someone else actually showed it to me as at the CSE conference when I came up with this idea. It showed me, say, look, Dimensions are doing this, and I was like, oh, this is
Yeah,
great.
I think it's one of the advanced filters that's available in the subscription product.
Yeah, that's what I thought. That makes sense. And I know, Dana, you've answered some questions in the chat already. Do you want to talk a little bit more about this taxonomy of related terms for SDGs and how that relates maybe to specific metadata fields?
Sure. To be honest, I don't know that there's a lot that I can say about the STM effort toward the taxonomy picker. This was an idea that actually sort of germinated with the fellows, saying, our observation was that it might be difficult for smaller publishers who, in many cases aren't even using a taxonomy to, develop their own SDG specific taxonomy, and that could certainly be a bar to classifying research via that method. And wouldn't it be nice if there was a publicly accessible and open taxonomy out there? And in terms of actually getting that done, we ended up, pushing that idea forward to STM as, an industry resource that could be developed. And I believe right now, that is not the top item that the committee that I'm on is working on. We're actually focusing most closely on the roadmap right now. So I believe the taxonomy picker work has been pushed forward to a task and finish group within STM, with some more technically oriented folks than those of us who are on the SR committee. So I am not 100% sure of the path that they're taking to get there and the timing that they're looking at. But I do know that it's work that's underway within STM. And what I was saying in response to Edward's question was, I hadn't really considered the publicly accessible aspect, since I haven't thought about that since we were talking about this idea in the fellows. That was really the idea there. But now I'm wondering, is STM thinking that this should be a member benefit for STM members? So I think that's worth our talking about in the SR committee. So I think, if we just go ahead and develop a taxonomy picker through STM that you need an STM membership to access, I think maybe that doesn't fulfill the spirit of what the fellows was trying to do. So I can advocate for that within SR. And then the other answer that I put in there was just that I looked up the cross-ref metadata fields, and SDGs certainly aren't in there. So that, I think, is an outreach effort that either the fellows or STM can take forward with cross-ref and see if there's anything on the horizon, or can we encourage and advocate for that to be added. Thanks.
Because Tyler, Dimensions feeds on Crossref data as well, post-publication, doesn't it? So that would be a way for you to kind of double check that as well, wouldn't it? If
We
some
do,
of the
yeah. So
metadata comes in.
totally, and it could be 360 degrees too. So essentially, if that data started, to be supported at Crossref, we could help populate it, or we could validate it as it comes in. So we got, but certainly we rely on Crossref data in a variety of ways that would be useful.
Yeah, and again, I think if we're looking at the metadata fields in general, that then also becomes perhaps something that can be embedded more in submission systems in general. Because I know, Sarah, your workflow is obviously very specific to your 2 journals, and I don't know how many other journals do it. You were like the first that I heard about. If this becomes more of a standard field, like more authors will be encouraged to put it in at submission, because I think like a lot of other issues I look at is if you're doing things early on, you don't have as much work later on in the process. So if you're starting to capture some information, even if it gets improved along the workflow, you're not starting from scratch post-publication and say, oh, what SDG is covered here. So I don't know if peer review systems have looked at our submission systems to include that information in a more standard way.
Not that I'm aware of right now. I didn't really hear much about implementing that to the best of my knowledge. The way that we really utilize it with an editorial manager is using the classifications functionality there, because it's kind of an easy way to do it. I do think that it is somewhat limiting, because it means you can't use the classification function for other things, essentially. So if you, let's say, have a different taxonomy that you want to be using for some reason, you wouldn't be able to really layer that, unfortunately, within our systems. So it is definitely right now something that individual journal teams kind of have to choose to do, which is definitely limiting from like an editorial sort of publisher perspective, at least for editorial manager.
Yeah. But that's how a lot of things start out, right? Everybody builds their own little things, and additional metadata fields, isn't it? Getting it standardized is a different story. So I imagine if that was something that was a Crossref metadata field, there's more encouragement to have it picked up early on in the process. I'm kind of all out of questions. I think I've asked everything I wanted to know. So if there's any questions you want to ask each other, or any other things you want to dig into.
Somebody just put something in the chat. Okay. So I think is that Edward's comment in the chat? I'm doing auto classification with a self-made taxonomy gleaned from various online resources. Yes, same. That's really how we began at ASCE. Kind of looking at what are the most relevant SDGs for the kind of content we publish. And then, I think from various looks at different sites and from Scopus and things like that, we pulled together, what we thought were the right terms for the relevant SDGs for us. But completely agree. I think if we're really going to maximize discoverability, consistency is incredibly important. And every publisher doing their own kind of thing and defining the SDGs in their own way, I think has a danger to really muddy the waters in terms of if you have a sea of stuff that's vaguely related, it's very difficult for the most relevant to surface.
One other thing we could talk about perhaps is, Tyler, what you've developed is using AI, but how would things like ChatGPT feature if you throw an article at it and say which SDGs are covered in this article, and how would that compare?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have not tested it out, although I'm sure somebody on our team probably already has. But I think a lot of our work went into developing the taxonomy and the keywords we're looking for and defining those. And again, as I mentioned, proximity and all the sort of nuances of that. But I'm sure that you could get partially there using ChatGPT or something like it. But again, that's just going to muddy the waters, because then you're starting to sort of use all kinds of different sources that have different approaches to things. So I think it needs more work and more curation than just basic AI.
It seems like one of the issues is agreeing on that kind of what constitutes a journal that covers an SDG, kind of defining, you know, each of those, like, so it's can be as specific as possible, and maybe you can have a range within. I know it's 17 different SDGs, but even within that, you could have some article that maybe touch on an SDG, whereas others are just like, you know, covering it in more detail. And the other thing I'm thinking here as I'm talking is, you know, sites that classified as citations in terms of supporting or agreeing with it or disagreeing with it. Again, that's something that might be, you know, if somebody discusses an SDG or covers it, you know, that kind of range within it that might help people certainly looking for content and promoting the content, perhaps to look at it. And I haven't actually asked them whether they cover SDGs, so that would be another interesting one.
Yeah. Well, and it's a good point, because there are SDGs like good health and well-being that have such a broad coverage of, you know, areas of touch, but also things like SDG 17, which is just partnership with the goals. It's like qualifying some of those would be really important as well.
I think this raises a lot of thoughts for me around the STM taxonomy and to what level we really should be coordinating and talking with NISO, because I think, you know, some level of standardization and industry buy-in can probably be helped with NISO being on board, just as they, you know, recently released the peer review taxonomy. If we could get behind industry standardization on SDG taxonomy, I think that would serve us well. I think the other thing, and this is something that I believe has been talked about within SDM, but I made a note to double check, is that, you know, I really think this is about more than just pulling out all the research that fits based on taxonomy. I think what we really need, at least from our experiences at ASCE, is a tool that ranks relevance as well. So we really need to be able to let the cream rise to the top, so to speak, if we're really going to achieve discoverability of the research, because, you know, our experience at ASCE, you know, especially that industry infrastructure and innovation one, you know, that, to Sarah's point, is so broad, it's not very helpful to unearth, you know, thousands of papers, and our team does an incredible amount of curation, manual curation, to ensure they're promoting the right content. So finding ways to automate that is incredibly important, or at least add some helpful automation.
Yeah, it's not quite as straightforward as an, you know, institutional identifier is that, or is that. It's a lot more depth within that. So in terms of metadata fields, yes, you can tick it, but then within that you need something else. There's another question that's popped up. If the Dimensions API is used to determine SDGs of an institution's publication output, can the results be shared publicly, or does the subscription license say it's for internal use only? Don't know if you know that, Tyler.
Quite the question. It depends. We have multiple licenses that allow for different terms of use, so it really just depends.
I'm sure the high level information might be able to be shared, even if it's not a detail, I'm guessing. But that's a good question. Any other key takeaways or things you might want to go and look at after some of the things we talked about today? And if not, I think I'll hop to the what's next. So if there's any kind of closing statements you want to make, any kind of main takeaways for people that are listening today on what your stance is on this. We'll start with Dana.
Sure. I guess my closing statement would be that, you know, SDM, the Social Responsibility Committee has set a goal that at least 50% of STM members become signatories to the compact. And I think we need to do as an industry a better job of communicating the relevance of the SDGs in what we do. It's key to all of our missions in scholarly communication, and I think that's not well understood. So I don't know that there's a key takeaway there, but please go forth and evangelize and move our industry in the right direction.
And that's, I mean, for me personally, I was ignoring it a little bit. I was like, oh, that has nothing to do with what I'm doing. And then I was in this session at CSE and I was like, hold on. And then Sarah in the session, made this comment to say they're capturing information in the submission. And I was like, well, then it's in the workflow. It does affect like probably a lot more people and organizations than we think once we look into where it spreads. And certainly I will go away and have some more thoughts on like what other discussions we can bring it up in. Yeah. What about you, Sarah?
Yeah, I guess in terms of kind of like what's next, I think that as like a publisher, we're continuing to consider how we can best utilize UN SDGs with our content, both at Chem and Chem Catalysis, but also in our larger portfolio. And yeah, just kind of keep it moving on with the progress, and hopefully things continue to, you continue to publish in these areas and that sort of thing and move forward.
You think this is something that would be expanded more? I know you manage more journals or even across Elsevier to capture that information at submission.
I think it's something that we're continuing to consider, essentially. So, we're continuing to launch new journals where never say never, but we'll see.
Thank you. What about you, Tyler? What other plans do you have or things you'll be looking at?
Yes, I'd say we continue to refine, our taxonomy and our approach to mapping to the SDGs, but also then expanding, to other artifacts of the research landscape and life cycle. So thinking about clinical trials or patents documents or supplementary data, and really starting to figure out, how can we apply the same classification to those to see if there's interesting analysis that can be pulled out of that as well. But really broadening the entire application of SDGs to everything in the research life cycle.
And do you think there'll be involvement with organizations like STM that are looking at taxonomy or planning to look at it as well when you already developed your own? And
well, I'm sure, yeah, there's always collaboration between us and STM, just thinking about things like this across the board, yeah.
Good. Yeah, wasn't sure if they were like completely separate. That's an odd question to ask, but that's good to hear. So there'll be alignment. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, all three of you, for joining me today to speak about this. This has been really interesting for me to see the different aspects and what's already been done and where we could be going. If you're new to the webinars, please feel free to sign up to our newsletter. We also have a specific events list where we just email out information about upcoming webinars, so feel free to join that. We've got